The whole audience chamber had gone still, and Lord Bron was holding up a ledger with my name in it like it was a knife, and the king had not said a single word in my defence. I stood in the middle of a hall built to make ordinary people feel like furniture, in my market apron, with a spice merchant's ledger being read aloud as though it proved I had been plotting against the crown since before I could walk, and I thought, watching the king's face give away nothing at all, that I had liked him a great deal better with a plate of stew in front of him and no crown on his head. But that is most of the way through, and a woman who tells you the middle before she has earned it deserves to be turned off. Let me go back to an ordinary market afternoon, and a stranger eating alone, who looked like the loneliest man I had ever seen. I sell spice at the eastern end of the market, pepper and saffron and the little jars of things that make plain food worth eating, which is a smaller trade than most and suits me fine, because I like a life I can carry in a handcart. I am an omega, with no pack of consequence, 24 years old, and I have never in my life been able to walk past a lonely person without doing something about it. It is not a virtue. It is closer to a compulsion. I have been told it will get me in trouble one day. I had rather assumed the trouble would be smaller than it turned out to be. There was a man who had started coming to the market square around midday, always alone, always at the same worn stone bench near the well, eating whatever the food stalls sold that day off a plain wooden trencher, surrounded by an empty ring of space that no one else in that crowded square ever seemed to sit in. He was tall and quiet, and dressed plainly enough that I took him for a well-off merchant's steward, someone with coin but no company. He never spoke to anyone. He ate with the careful, deliberate manners of a man eating alone so often he had made a private ceremony of it, just to have something to do with his hands. I watched him for 3 days before I did anything foolish about it. On the 4th, I picked up my little folding stool, walked across the square with my own bread and cheese, and sat down across from him without asking. He looked up at me with an expression of such total astonishment that you would have thought I had sprouted a second head. "You looked like you could use company," I said, breaking my bread in half and handing him the larger piece before he could object. "And you looked like nobody's ever once told you that eating alone in a crowded square is the loneliest thing in the world to watch. So, I'm seen. I sell spice at the east stalls, my feet hurt, and you have the saddest posture I've seen on a man who isn't actually being punished for something." "I am not being punished," he said, very slowly, as though testing whether the words still worked in his mouth. Could have fooled me. I took a bite of cheese. "What's your name?" He hesitated. It was the strangest hesitation I have ever watched a grown man have over his own name, as if he had several to choose between, and was weighing which one would ruin the afternoon. "Ronan," he said finally. "Well, Ronan, eat your bread before it gets cold, and tell me why a man with hands that soft," I had noticed, taking the bread from him, that his palms had none of the calluses of honest work, is sitting alone in a market square every day, looking like the world just ended and he's too polite to mention it. He did not answer that. He ate his bread, slowly, and listened while I talked, about the merchant 3 stalls down who watered his pepper, about the boy who kept trying to steal saffron and getting caught by his own sneeze, about the entire, unbroken, chattering catalogue of my ordinary day. I am told I talk a great deal when I am nervous, and I am told I am often nervous around people who look like they are carrying something heavy and won't say what. I talked at that man for the better part of an hour, and he said perhaps 12 words in return, and every single one of them he seemed to weigh like coin he was not sure he was allowed to spend. 2 guards came jogging into the square near the end of it, scanning the crowd with the particular urgency of men who have lost something valuable, and I watched Ronan's whole posture change, straighten, harden, become someone else entirely. A heartbeat before they reached us. "There you are," one of them said, with the relief of a man who has just avoided a very bad afternoon. "My lord, the council." "I am aware," Ronan said. in a voice that had gone flat and cool and entirely unlike the man who had just spent an hour listening to me talk about saffron thieves. He rose. He looked at me, and something crossed his face I could not read, and he said, "Thank you for the bread," in a tone that made it sound like the strangest, most valuable gift anyone had ever given him. Then he was gone, swallowed by his guards, and I sat there on my folding stool, wondering what kind of steward gets a jogging escort and calls it the council. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and every day for 2 weeks I carried my folding stool across the square at midday and sat down across from the quiet man at the well and talked his ear off and shared whatever I had. And he ate it all like a man who had never once tasted food that good, which made no sense at all for someone who could presumably afford better than a spice seller's bread. I did not ask who he was. I told myself it was not my business. If I am honest, some part of me had already guessed enough to be afraid of the answer, and I did not want to lose the ordinary afternoons by naming what they actually were. If you want to know who the quiet man at the well really was, and what almost cost me my neck for sitting down across from him, then stay with me. Follow this one to the end. I had a story about who I was talking to for 2 whole weeks. It was mostly true. The part that wasn't is the part that turned everything upside down. The wolf found me on the 9th day. I was folding up my stall for the evening when an enormous grey animal padded out of an alley and sat down directly in front of my cart, blocking the path of 2 men who had been sizing up my unattended coin box all afternoon. It did not growl, it simply sat, immense and immovable, until the men decided the spice seller's takings were not worth the trouble, and then it looked at me with an expression of frank, patient expectation, as though it had been sent specifically to do this, and was waiting to be thanked. "You're his," I said, understanding at once whose animal this had to be, and my stomach did something complicated. "Aren't you?" The wolf's tail thumped once against the cobbles. It walked me home that evening, an uninvited and enormous escort, and left me at my own door with what I can only describe as a satisfied air, and came back the next morning to walk me to the market, and kept doing both every day after that, without a word of explanation from anyone. I understood, somewhere around the 4th morning of my new escort, exactly who I had been sharing bread with at the well. There is only one wolf in the Iron Territories, large enough and grand enough to move through a crowded market without a single soul daring to shoo it off, and it does not belong to a steward. I did not stop going to the well. I want that understood, because everyone who has ever heard this story assumes I must have panicked, or grown suddenly deferential, or started addressing him by title. I did none of it. I decided, sitting there with the truth settling cold and strange in my chest, that whatever he was to the rest of his kingdom, he had been, for 2 weeks, simply a lonely man at a bench who had never learned what it was to be talked at for the joy of it, and I was not going to be the person who ruined that by suddenly bowing. So the next day I sat down across from the Alpha King of the Iron Territories, and I broke my bread in half, and I said, "Your wolf is a menace, Ronan, and also excellent company, and I have decided not to make a fuss about who you actually are, because you clearly haven't been enjoying being fussed over." He went very still. "You know. I've known for 4 days. Your wolf isn't subtle." I handed him the larger piece of bread, same as always. "Are you going to stop coming now that I know?" "No," he said, so quickly and so plainly that I understood, more than anything he had said in 2 weeks, exactly how much those afternoons had come to matter to him. "No. I would like." He stopped himself, the way I had already noticed he stopped himself often, weighing a thing before he let it out. "I would like to keep coming. If you will still have me." "I'll still have you," I said, "though I reserve the right to make fun of you for eating like a man who's never had a decent meal, which you clearly have not, because a king who's never had someone talk his ear off over cheese has been having a very sad time of it." He laughed. It surprised him as much as it surprised me. A short, rusty, wondering sound, like a door opening that had not been used in years. That was when the courting began, and I want to be honest that it was, without question, the most ridiculous fortnight of my life. Because Ronan the man had spent an hour a day at a market bench being simply himself, unguarded and easy, and Ronan the king apparently had no idea how to translate that into courtship, and so he did what a man does when he has decided on a great undertaking and has no earthly instinct for how to execute it gently. He formalized everything. He sent a written proposal of intent to my father's stall. I have no father, which flustered the messenger considerably, outlining in precise legal language his intention to court the spice seller Sine with a view toward marriage, itemized with clauses. He arranged, without asking me, a formal procession of gifts delivered to my stall each morning at the same hour, with the punctuality of a military campaign. A bolt of good wool on the first day, a chest of proper cooking spices on the second, each one accompanied by a card written in the stiff, over-careful hand of a man translating a feeling into a report. I have never laughed so hard at a man's sincerity in my life. He meant every ridiculous overture with his whole chest, and executed each one with all the precision and none of the ease he had shown me at the well, and I began to understand that Ronan had learned, somewhere along the way, that love was a thing done correctly rather than a thing simply felt, and that no one had ever shown him the difference. The wolf, meanwhile, ran its own campaign with considerably more instinct. It began saving me a seat. I would arrive at the well to find it lying pointedly across the second half of the bench, so no one else could sit there, guarding an empty space with the patience of a soldier. Once, when a rival stallholder tried to muscle my cart out of its usual spot in the square, the wolf simply appeared and sat on the man's foot until he reconsidered. And when I lent a threadbare shawl to an old woman who complained of the cold, the wolf returned 3 days later with a fine new shawl in its jaws and dropped it in my lap, having apparently decided, on its own authority, that a debt had been noticed and required settling with interest. "Your beast is running circles around your courtship," I told him, one afternoon, laughing so hard I nearly choked on my bread. "It's been wooing me properly for a week. You're still sending me itemized wool." "I am aware," Ronan said, with the particular grimness of a proud man watching his own instincts outpace his execution. "I do not know how to do the other thing. I have never—" He stopped himself again. "Never what?" I said, gentler now. "I have never once had an unstaged conversation with a woman who did not already know she was speaking to the king," he said, and something in his voice had gone raw. "Every meeting arranged for me since I was old enough to be considered a match has been managed. A noble daughter positioned to encounter me in a garden that was not her garden. A ride that was not accidental. My counsel believes I do not notice. I notice everything. I simply stopped saying so, because saying so changed nothing." He looked at his hands. "You are the first person in my adult life who spoke to me before you knew what I was worth. I do not know how to court someone honestly. I have never been permitted to be courted honestly myself, so I have no template for offering it. I am trying, Scene. I am aware that I am trying very badly." I did not laugh at that. I reached across and took the itemized wool report out of his hands and set it face down on the bench, gently, the way you set down something that has done its job and is allowed to rest now. "Then stop trying so hard to do it correctly," I said, "and just come sit with me." That's the whole of it. That's all it ever was. That was the moment his shoulders came down an inch, for the first time since I'd known him, and I understood I had just watched something in him believe for the first time that it might actually be allowed to be that simple. Lord Bronn did not want it to be that simple. He was the king's chief advisor, a smooth, careful man who managed the crown's correspondence and, I would learn, a great deal more than correspondence. He came to my stall on the 10th day of the courtship, in fine grey robes, and he did not threaten me. Clever men rarely do. "You have caused quite a stir, spice seller," he said, examining my little jars with one soft finger. The king has never courted openly before. It is, in its way, wonderful to see him animated. But I feel I must, out of care for you as much as for the crown, explain the shape of a thing you may not fully understand. His voice was warm, reasonable, ruinous. Kings are matched, not chosen. For reasons that have nothing to do with the heart and everything to do with borders and grain and treaties that keep whole villages fed through the winter. It has been my life's work to see that the king's affections, when they finally settled somewhere the kingdom could survive. I would hate to watch a sweet, unremarkable woman be crushed under the weight of a fondness that can never actually be permitted to become anything. Enjoy his company while it lasts, but do not, I beg you, let yourself believe it can end anywhere but badly. He left me with that, and it did precisely the work he intended. It sat cold in my chest for the rest of the day, because it was clever, and it wore the mask of kindness, and it named the exact fear I had been trying not to look at directly. But I have talked to a great many lonely people in my life, and I have learned to trust what I notice over what I am warned. And what I noticed, turning Lord Bron's warm little speech over in my mind that night, was how very well informed it had been. He had known, precisely, the shape of every accidental match the king had ever nearly made. He had spoken of them the way a man speaks of his own careful handiwork, not the way a courtier speaks of fate's coincidences. And I began, slowly, to understand something Ronan himself did not yet see. I asked him outright, the next day at the well. How many times, I said, has the council arranged for you to accidentally meet someone? Truly, think hard. Ronan considered it, and I watched the answer dawn on him as he counted, and I watched his face change as the number kept climbing. A great many, he said slowly. Every year of my adult life. I always assumed it was simply how the world worked for a king, that every meeting of consequence would naturally be managed, because everything of consequence in my life has always been managed. He went very still. Bronn arranges the council's calendar. Bronn arranges my correspondence. Bronn would have arranged every single one of those gardens and rides. He came to my stall yesterday, I said, to warn me off you, very kindly, and he knew the exact shape of every match you'd ever nearly made, like a man reading back his own ledger. I watched the last of it land in him. Ronan, in your whole life, has anyone who wasn't your own wolf ever met you without someone else arranging it first? He did not answer for a long time. When he did, his voice had gone quiet and strange. The voice of a man discovering, very late, the actual size of a room he had thought was the whole world. You, he said. You are the only unmanaged thing that has ever happened to me. That was the moment the cheerful, unbothered chatter went out of me entirely, and something sharper, fiercer, took its place. Because I understood, sitting there, exactly what Bronn had been protecting all those years. And it was never the kingdom's borders. A king who is never permitted an unmanaged encounter is a king who can be steered his whole life without ever once feeling the hand on the reins. And Bronn had built a career, and a great deal of quiet influence, on being the one hand that steered. A real match, chosen freely, by a king who noticed everything, and had simply never been given the chance to act on it. That was the one outcome Bronn's whole careful architecture could not survive. He's not protecting you from me, I said. He's protecting his own grip on you from me. And I am done letting a smooth-voiced man decide, from a garden he arranged himself, who you're allowed to actually want. Bronn made his real move at the audience Ronan called to formalize the courtship before the full court. A foolish, brave, over-prepared gesture, entirely in character, the king attempting once more to do a feeling correctly by making it official. Bronn had clearly seen it coming and prepared his own ledger long in advance. He rose before the whole hall could react to the king's announcement, and he held up a merchant's account book, my account book, or a forgery close enough to fool a room that had never seen the real one, and read from it in a voice pitched to carry to every rafter. Debts, Irregularities. A pattern, he said gravely, of a spice seller who had systematically undercharged certain merchants and overcharged others in a manner that, examined closely, looked very much like the careful groundwork of a woman positioning herself for exactly this outcome. He did not call me a schemer outright. He did not have to. He built the ledger so that any defense I offered would sound like exactly the manipulation he was describing, and he built it in front of every lord who had ever wondered whether the king's new fondness was too sudden to be real. That is the moment I began this story with, the ledger raised like a knife, the hall gone still, the king silent. He was silent, I understood afterward, because he was letting Bronn climb all the way out onto the branch before he cut it. He let the whole ledger be read. He let the whole court commit itself to doubting me. And then he rose, and he did not raise his voice, because he had learned, in 2 weeks at a market bench, that a thing said plainly carries further than a thing shouted. That ledger is false, he said, and I know it is false. Because I have watched this woman work her own accounts with my own eyes for 2 weeks, sharing her lunch with a stranger she did not know was her king, asking nothing of me the entire time, because she did not know there was anything to ask for. His eyes went to Bronn, and they were very cold. You have arranged every meaningful encounter of my adult life, Lord Bronn. Every garden, every ride, every convenient coincidence that put a suitable daughter in my path at the suitable hour. I let it pass for years, because I believed it was simply how a king's world worked. I no longer believe that. I think you built me a life, with no unmanaged rooms in it, because a king who has never chosen anything for himself is a king who can always be led, and the one time something happened to me that you did not arrange, you moved to destroy it before it could cost you your grip. The hall's doubt turned, all at once, the way weather turns. Bronn did not wait to be formally accused. A cornered, clever man never does. He reached for the one lever he had left. He called for the guard, claiming the king had been bewitched, that an Omega spice seller had no business at a royal audience, and less business influencing a crown. And in the scramble of the hall, dividing itself between his voice and the king's, he made a grab for me himself, to have me removed, before I could speak another word in my own defence. I have no wolf, and no rank, and no strength worth mentioning. But I had 2 hands and a great deal of very recent fury, and I twisted free of his grip long enough to shout the one thing I knew would matter more than any ledger. Ask him, I said, loud enough to fill the hall, how he knew, down to the very hour, that I would be sitting at that well the first day the king ever spoke to me. Ask him how a lonely man's private habit of eating alone at midday was known well enough by his own advisor to be avoided, managed, and steered, for years, unless someone was watching every single meeting closely enough to arrange the ones that mattered, and quietly ignore the one he never expected to matter at all. The hall went very quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet when it has just heard the one question no one has an innocent answer for. And into that silence, the king's wolf came through the doors at a dead run. I have never learned how it always seemed to know precisely when it was needed, and it did not go for me. It went for Bronn, driving him back from me with a snarl that finally, said plainly what the beast had been too patient to say the whole 2 weeks. It had been quietly courting me on its master's behalf, that it had known the truth of this man long before either of us did, and had simply been waiting for us to catch up. They found the rest in Bronn's own rooms within the week. Years of careful correspondence, a whole quiet architecture of managed encounters and steered matches. A man who had made himself indispensable by making sure the king never once had to choose anything alone. He is stripped of his office now, and exiled from the council chambers he ran for a decade, and I am told he did not accept the ruling gracefully. I did not need to watch it to be satisfied. Ronan came to me in the chaos after, in front of the whole recovering court, and he did not manage the moment, and he did not itemize it, and he did not send a written proposal ahead of it. He simply took my hand, the way he had taken bread from mine on the very first day. And he said, "Roughly, I have spent my whole life being introduced to people. I would like, for the rest of it, to simply be sat down next to." His thumb moved over my knuckles. "You are the only unmanaged thing that has ever happened to me, Sine, and I intend to spend the remainder of my reign making sure it stays that way. Stay, not because a council arranged it. Because I am finally asking for something myself. I stood in the wreckage of a royal audience with a king's hand in mine, and I did the only thing I have ever known how to do, which is tell the truth. I sat down across from a sad man eating alone because I felt sorry for him," I said, and the whole hall leaned in to hear the spice seller answer the king. "I didn't know he'd never had a meal that good in his whole life, and I certainly didn't know he was you. I'm glad I didn't know. I think if I had, I'd have been too careful to just talk your ear off the way I did." I let him see me smile. "That's not a Luna's decision. It's just what happens when nobody warns you which man not to sit down with." He kissed me then, one breath, no more. A kiss that said a whole sentence and did not need to become a scene. And what broke open in me was not the thing the songs promise. It was recognition, plain and total, the vertigo of being the first real thing that had ever happened to a man everyone else had spent a lifetime managing. His wolf shoved its great head between us, thoroughly satisfied. And the court that had gathered to watch a king formalize a courtship watched instead the strongest wolf alive claim. At long last, the one woman who had never once known there was anything to claim. Here is the part I kept for last. The stool. I still have my little folding stool from the market, battered, the wood worn smooth on both seats from 2 weeks of afternoons, before either of us knew what we were sitting down to. Ronan asked to keep it in the palace, in our own rooms, when I would have thrown it out as a scrap not fit for a king's household. He said he wanted, on the days ceremony grew too heavy, somewhere to sit that had never once been arranged for him. It sits by our window now. We do not use it often. Some things are worth more kept than worn. A year on, I am the Luna of the Iron Territories, which still strikes me as a delivery meant for someone else's stall. I still sell spice, 3 mornings a week, because I like a life I can carry in a handcart, and because the king insists on coming with me, unguarded when he can manage it, to sit with whoever looks loneliest in the square that day. It has become something of a habit at court. The lords do not quite know what to make of a king who eats his lunch on a public bench beside strangers, but the strangers, I notice, keep coming back. A letter came last week from the merchant 3 stalls down who used to water his pepper and resented my honest jars for making his look thin by comparison, writing now, very stiffly, to congratulate the new Luna and hope old rivalries might be forgotten. I had Ferris write the reply, since my hand for letters is poor from a life spent weighing spice instead of holding a pen. I did not gloat. Gloating and grace wear the same coat, in my experience, and it is hard to tell them apart from a distance. Easier up close, where you can see which one is smiling. I confirmed I bore him no ill will, and added that he might try selling honest pepper for once, since it had done rather well for me. Ronan found me dictating it at his own table, in the seat at his right hand, his wolf a warm weight across both our feet, the old market stool tucked by the window, where the afternoon light finds it. "What are you telling him?" the king asked, reading over my shoulder. "The truth," I said. That no one told her the quiet man eating alone in the market was the Alpha King, and she sat down anyway. I looked at him, still faintly astonished. Even now, every time someone simply chooses to sit with him, she felt sorry for him eating by himself. He'd never had a meal that good in his life. Turns out that was the whole secret. Nobody had ever just sat down. "So, before I let you go, tell me what you think, because I have turned it over for a year, and I still cannot quite settle it. Do you believe his wolf recognized something in me the very first week? patient and certain the way an animal is certain, and simply waited for the two of us to catch up to what it already knew? Or do you think it was only a lonely man, managed his whole life, who finally had one afternoon that wasn't arranged for him and could not bear to let it go? Tell me your theory below. I have lived inside the answer a year now, and I have decided I do not actually need to choose. And if you want to stay at this table, the market bench by the window, the strangers he still sits with, whoever looks loneliest in the square next, comment the wolf and follow along, because I have made a whole life out of sitting down uninvited next to people who need it, and I have no plans to stop, crown or no crown. Where are you listening from tonight? Pull up the stool. There's room on both sides of it, and I promise, whoever you are, I will talk your ear off.